Well, hello there and welcome to fall. You guys know if there's one thing I love more than decorating the house, it's cooking. So today I'm going to be making my favorite fall cream tomato soup with puff pastry, or you can call it a tomato soup en croûte. But this is one of the most amazing soups in the world, very creamy, lots of fat, and super delicious. If you're new here, my name is Lauren. I love to do all things homemaking, so cooking and decorating and doing some special things for our family. And if you're returning, it's so good to see you. Okay, let's jump right into this video. So for tonight's dinner, I'm going to be doing the tomato soup with puff pastry. I picked up my puff pastry at the store. I'm using some tomato paste, some fresh basil. I'm going to use 3 different cheeses for a brioche and basil kind of grilled cheese, which is super good. Then we're going to make some garlic crostini. These are things I like to have to dip into our soup. And then we're going to be using a ton of butter and garlic and onions and cream. And I'll just link everything down below because we're using quite a few things today. So before I cook, I like to prep all of my ingredients. That way, when the kids come in from school and I just know I've got exactly what I need right here next to the stove, I can just throw it in and keep it moving for the day. So for this, I'm going to be doing a couple things. For the garlic, I'm going to prep half garlic for our crostini, and then I'm also going to be using some of that garlic to make a paste, which I'll show you a little bit later in this video. So for the tomatoes, you can do this 2 ways. A lot of these recipes call for you to actually hollow out the tomato. I like to actually keep the juice, but I do separate them. So what I like to do is chop them all up and then hollow out the center, but I keep the juice. I'm going to press that using a strainer, and we're going to actually add it back into the soup later in this video. I'm going to be using some garlic and some yellow onion in the soup as well. The first thing we're going to do is actually cook that down. But for the crostini, what I like to do is to cut the bread up, and then I will use basically a garlic paste. So to make a garlic paste, you guys know this is how I always do it. I put a little bit of salt on top, and then I use the flat edge of my knife and I kind of smash it down until it turns into a paste form. What's nice about using the salt is you won't have to salt your dish after. So I highly recommend, if you're going to use salt in your dish, like don't use this then salt, because you're double salting. But once you smash it all down, the garlic actually breaks down the acids and turns it into a bit of a liquid, making it so much easier to smash up. So for our crostini, I'm just going to slice these up and throw them on a tray. I'm going to add in a little bit of this olive oil, and we're just going to paint this on to these crostinis and throw it in the oven at about 325, 350, somewhere in there, and for about 10 minutes, or until you see them a little golden brown. So for the grilled cheese, I decided to get a little fancy and use one of my favorite French breads, which is a brioche bread, which is basically like any other standard bread using water, flour, salt, and yeast, except with brioche, you add in eggs, butter, and milk, which makes it super rich and delicious and buttery and just like over the top good. So for this, I like to actually use either a Gruyere cheese or a white cheddar. The kids like the white cheddar, my husband and I like the Gruyere, so I'm going to be cutting up a little bit of that. And then I like to add in some fresh basil. I'll show you how we do this on a flat pan, and I also like to butter it even more. So there's going to be a lot of butter in these recipes. I'm sorry in advance. Okay, so to get started with our soup, we're going to be adding a stick of butter, and we're going to let that melt down slowly. We don't want the butter to actually burn. That's called brown butter, which is also really good for a lot of other things, but not for today. So we're going to slowly let that come down to a nice simmer. We're going to add in our garlic, let that cook until it's a little fragrant and translucent for about a minute. Then we're going to add in our onions. I like to stew these down at a very low minimum heat. That way they don't cook, but the flavors from the onions and the garlic will start to infuse the butter, which also, if you guys have ever done like infused butters, you can actually do this by adding like anything, lavender, you can add rosemary, anything in here, and then actually strain the butter, so then your butter actually has some nice herb, an influence in it. So to start the base, we're going to be adding some sage. I added some thyme, and this is where the spice comes in. So adding the whole peppercorn, it's going to actually bring the pepper flavor into the soup, but later we're going to be blending this all down. I don't know if you guys know this, but peppercorn does get really soft once it's been kind of boiled. So let that sit for a good 10 minutes with the top on. Really let those flavors incorporate nicely into the onions and garlic. And then we're going to start adding our tomatoes. Before we add our tomato paste and our tomatoes, I like to remove our herbs. That way they don't get lost in the soup. And if you do blend them, it tends to kind of create a bitter flavor. So we want to actually remove those now, and we'll add in 8 ounces of tomato paste, and then we're going to throw our tomatoes in. I'm going to stew this down for a good 20 minutes, maybe a little longer. And then throughout, as it starts to cook down and kind of turn into almost like a tomato sauce, we're going to start adding in some of that juice. I have it here over to the side. That's as much as I could squeeze out. But the nice thing is it really kind of creates a consistency of a soup without letting this get too much into a sauce. I'm also going to be adding about a cup of our chicken stock. That way I can kind of continue to keep the flavors, but you can add water to this and it'd be just as delicious. Once we've allowed that to simmer really, really low heat for about 40 minutes, we're going to be taking it to the blender. Now I have a Vitamix, but you can literally use any type of blender. Just make sure that it can withhold the heat, because sometimes you never know. I like to see this consistency right here where it's a bit soupy. I've thrown in my sage leaf, which I then remove because again, we don't want to blend that in here. And I'm going to throw it into our Vitamix. I'm going to blend this very slowly and then bring it up very slowly. That way I try to get as much of that peppercorn as possible. You don't want to be eating this soup and then have like a really spicy peppercorn in there. So the consistency should be a little bit like baby food, because then we're going to be adding in our cream. Once you're done, go ahead and return that back to the pot. Now, if you don't want to add a ton of cream, you can actually stop here and then continue with the puff pastry. This is super delicious if you want just tomato. I like to do it super fatty, so we're gonna add in the cream later. I wanted to make one of these a little spicy, so I'm gonna be adding a can of chipotle in here. You guys know, if you've seen any of my other recipes from fall, which I will link a bunch down below, or you can head over to my website at laurennicholson.com and download a bunch. I have a pumpkin spice chipotle hummus on there that will blow your mind. But anyway, this is how I break down my chipotle. I just add a little water in there and keep blending it and blending it and blending it till it's super liquid. We're gonna add that to one little pot. That way I can have an extra spicy one, and then the kids will eat this one here. So once you've allowed your soup to come to a little bit of a simmer, we're going to add 2 pints of heavy whipping cream. I know this sounds really disgusting, but just trust me, you guys, this is one of the best recipes ever. So we're going to add those in, and I'm going to slowly bring that to a really nice simmer. I'm going to use a little whisk just to kind of bring it together. I really want the tomato and the fat of the butter and also this cream to really incorporate nicely. Now I'm going to split off a little bit of this because I want to make sure I can have a spicy one for myself, and then I'm also going to be having this big pot for the whole family. Now, I made this the night before. That way I can refrigerate it overnight, but you really can only refrigerate for 2 hours. So you could make this in the morning and then have it ready to go at night. The puff pastry only takes about 15 minutes. So I'm going to actually do this overnight, and you're catching me on the next day ready to go. So I pulled this out of the refrigerator. I'm going to bring it up to a slow boil. You want it to be hot when it goes into bowls. So I want to bring this to a simmer. And while that's happening, we're going to get our puff pastry out. So if you haven't worked with puff pastry before, it is so fun. You can get it at Target or any grocery store. It's usually over by like the pre-made cookie stuff, but I'm going to give you one really great tip. Keep this in the freezer until about an hour or so before you need to use it, and then throw it in the refrigerator. It needs to be super cold in order to work with. It's kind of like using a pie crust, but it's a little fussy. So these bowls I use are specifically for this, or I use this also for my French onion soup, but I like to cut it a little bit bigger because I want it to actually cascade over the bowl, and we want to keep it nice and tight. Now, one other trick I can give you is we're going to fill this bowl up with soup only 3/4 of the way. We don't want the puff pastry to actually touch the soup or it won't work. It needs to be completely dry. And we're also going to paint on a nice egg wash, which is basically 1 egg in a dish with a little bit of water. Mix that all together, and then we're going to use a little paintbrush. I actually picked this cute one up at Hobby Lobby, but we're just going to paint on a little of the egg wash on the inside. Then using this kind of transfer paper, it's just parchment paper, I'm going to actually flip it over to the top of this bowl, secure it tightly. We want to keep it nice and tight. You'll see how I use the parchment paper to kind of help me pull it tight. And then I'm going to actually paint it as well on top. Once you're done, we're going to throw both of these on that little sheet pan over there, and we're going to bake that for about 10 to 15 minutes or until the dough is golden brown. Another tip for this recipe, or again, if you're going to use this for a French onion soup, same idea, using the puff pastry and then using the egg wash. The egg wash is really what's going to help it be really glossy and beautiful and crunchy on top. But one of the other pieces of advice I can give you when working with puff pastry is once you put it in the oven and you close it, turn the light on so you can watch it, but don't open the oven, because if you do, it will collapse the puff pastry. The puff pastry needs to be in intense heat for at least the first 5 to 10 minutes. That way it really does its magic where the puff pastry separates, and that's what gives it all those flaky layers. It's so good. I cannot wait for you guys to try this, but I'm going to be throwing this in the oven for 15 minutes and then we'll take it out and see what you guys think. So while that's cooking, I'm going to get our little brioche melted cheese sandwiches, as Georgette calls them, together. And this is pretty simple. Now, you don't have to use butter, but I just am going to be extra and use all the butter in the world because it just makes it so much better. But I'm going to be adding some of this white cheddar onto these, and then I'm going to do a couple with the Gruyere. So just simply butter both sides, and then you also want to add that fresh basil on top. This way when you crunch into it, it has that nice brightness of the basil. You could also put on sun-dried tomatoes if you wanted to, but since we're having tomato soup, I didn't want to be too extra with all the tomatoes, so I just did basil. But anyway, we're going to do these, and then I'm going to cut them up so that they're kind of long shaped. That way we can dip them right into our soup. So it's time to pull out our tomato puff pastry soup and get dinner on the table. These look so beautiful. Now you could have cooked this a little bit longer, but I just like it at this kind of temperature here. This is nice and flaky for the kids and not too overdone, so you can kind of go both ways. But I've seen it done where they're a lot darker than this. This is just how we like to do it. But I'm gonna cut up these sandwiches long way. That way, again, I can make them like little dipping sticks for the kids to dip right into the soup. And then I'm also gonna get our crostini out, which my husband prefers over the sandwiches. So I like to have these. They're so good, so garlicky. Oh my gosh, you guys, you have to try these. You can even do this with the hummus. I will definitely link down below all my other fall recipes because you know I just love to cook. So here's how it all turned out. I am so excited you joined me today with this amazing cozy fall soup recipe. If you make it, please tag me at Mrs. Lauren Nicholson on Instagram. Share all the photos in your stories and I'll definitely reshare them as well. Thank you so much for checking out this recipe, and I cannot wait to share so much more with you guys in the coming videos. Definitely tell me in the comments down below if you've made this soup before or if you've ever had it. I know there's a couple French restaurants that definitely specialize in this, but definitely tell me if you have, because it is really truly one of the best soups ever. One other thing I wanted to share with you is one of the ways I love to enjoy this is, like, it's so funny because you'll find people like to enjoy this a million different ways. I like to actually fold all of my puff pastry into my soup, let it kind of absorb in, and then I like to eat it that way. My kids don't. They like to put a hole in the middle and then they like to dip their grilled cheese sandwiches and eat it that way. A lot of times they won't even eat the puff pastry, which is such a waste. Thanks for Daddy and I, because we'll always come through and finish the rest. But I'm so happy again that you guys joined me. If you're new here, I'd be so honored if you would subscribe to my channel for more cooking and decorating videos, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye.